it's my privilege to, I'm going to, in just a moment, introduce our speaker and her husband. But for anybody else new here today or returning after a long absence, yes.
I guess kind of. Danford Moore, my wife Becky, and our daughter Amelia. This is my first time in the service. So.
Oh, Danford, it's good to have you upstairs.
Yeah, it's good to be upstairs.
Yeah.
I got kicked out as a kid last time.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. Well, it's my privilege today to get to introduce the Reverend Dr. Sally Godard, MD, who's had a long career as a psychiatrist and continues to consult at Linfield University Student Health, Wellness, and Counseling Center. Reverend Dr. Godard also has a master's degree in divinity that she earned from Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. After seminary, she was ordained as a United Church of Christ minister with an emphasis on justice and witness ministries. Reverend Dr. Godard met many of the folks from this congregation while working with Unido's bridging community. She and her husband, Ron Ulisar, lived near McMinnville. They've got a little farm with an orchard and some goats, and they have 3 married children and 5 grandchildren. Today, Dr. Godard will be talking with us about working for justice as a spiritual practice. Welcome, Dr.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be back with you all, seeing old friends and meeting new friends. I'm delighted to be here. You all haven't forgotten me, I can tell, because you've stuck a clock right in the middle of this podium. And you know I have to pay attention to it. There's so much to say, isn't there? Okay, let's get all our equipment. I decided to bring a slideshow for a couple reasons. One, because I think the photos will be interesting to folks. And the other reason is, you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and then that way I can subtract a few words. And are we close?
Almost here, I think it's. Go to, let's see, let me do this again. Just make sure it's here.
It's on.
Oh, it came on and then I took it out. There we go. And then.
Those single input.
Okay, you can go to presenter mode. There should be try that.
This isn't taken up to it yet.
Let's see that. Oh, always technical things, huh? Don't we love those? Not really. Okay. Yeah, there we go.
I've told him that I have to die first because I couldn't get along without him doing this part of it. He has magic spells that he uses to make things work eventually.
Eventually it's supposed to, let's see if we can get that one right there. And here. Yeah. Well, you know what? Actually, if you want me to do this here for a second, you want to start with an introduction.
There it is.
There's that.
Get in there?
Put it in there. And then
Now we're trying to get the little mouse to work.
why the mouse isn't.
There, it's starting. It's starting.
Oh, I see it. A little battery on the mouse. That'll do it. Thank you. Okay, so
It
now,
at least tells us.
now you should be able to do this.
Thank you, Ron.
Yes. Yeah.
Let's do this.
You guys do.
It's a serious and glorious thing just to be alive on this fresh morning in the broken world. And we certainly have a broken world that keeps us feeling heavy and discouraged. And it's a morning for us to come together as a community, to be here, to raise each other's spirits, to remember what our values are and our goals are, and to, as a community, work together toward the better world, toward the beloved community. I'm delighted to share with you some of the experiences that Ron and I have been involved in over the last couple of years. I do feel a bit vulnerable about this, though, because I don't have either answers or results. And as an introvert, I like to have everything tidied up into a beginning and a middle and an end before I present publicly. That ain't gonna happen. So this morning, I'm going to try to be more extroverted and bring you along midway in this process, midway as collaborators. Indeed, this project needs a community.
Use the arrow buttons on the computer.
Okay. Thank you. I'll just do that. Our adventure is based 2,300 miles away in Holly Springs, Mississippi, a small town with a long history. This project has taken time, energy, money, and we unintentionally acquired a house. More than once, every week, I've asked myself, why am I doing this? What is compelling me? I can't reassure myself rationally or intellectually or even psychologically. So recently I've been thinking about the spiritual component of this project, and it's these ideas I bring to you today. But let's first look at the project. Ron, will you stand up and point out the little bit of property that is now under the ownership of a small and depleted family foundation called the Rosa Foundation. Holly Springs, Mississippi doesn't often have snow, but when it does, we take pictures. In 1839, Hugh and Elizabeth Craft began their move from Georgia after the financial crash of 1837, and it left him nearly bankrupt. But Hugh had contracted with the federal government to become a land agent. The federal government had just acquired the Chickasaw land in Mississippi, and now it was time to sell it to the new settlers. They needed new land to continue and restart their cotton business. In 1851, this house was built. An older building to the left of the house was deemed sufficient to house the enslaved Africans, one who came with them from Georgia and the others who were purchased more recently. By 1860, 9 enslaved people lived in the quarters, most of whom were children. You can see some of them in this pre-war photo with children on the steps there, the owners of the house and the property standing in front of the front door. Just barely seen, very old photo. This is how it looks now after we've been working on it for 2 years. It's been pretty much run down, but you can see the quarters a little better. We learned about a project that had been hatched on this same property. The project began about 10 years earlier. This project was very unique to Mississippi, to northern Mississippi especially, for its theme and its diversity of the group behind the project. I couldn't believe it. I said, this can't be happening in Holly Springs. So I had to learn more about it. It was called Behind the Big House, and it developed from a unique bit of history. At this time, Holly Springs had been holding what they called the pilgrimage, the spring pilgrimage, for about 75 years. This is when all the antebellum houses in the town, and in this town there are a lot of them, because Grant used this town as his southern headquarters during the Civil War, and thus these houses were preserved. And in the 30s, when they weren't having enough and didn't have enough money to restore and keep up on these houses, they started this pilgrimage. They'd decorate the houses as best they could. The women would wear big flowing hoop skirt dresses, and the men would dress up in their ties and dinner jackets, and they would invite people from all over the country, and they would come in busloads to see these beautiful homes. But the stories of those who lived behind or beside the big house were never told. These stories were neglected, avoided, or suppressed. They didn't come out in these historic pilgrimage tours. So Behind the Big House was created by a diverse group of people to tell the true, the complete, the full story. The couple who owned the big house and these slave quarters were able to bring this group together and change this narrative. Each spring, a 3-day event invited visitors and school children to Behind the Big House. We participated and led some of the activities last April. It was very exciting because more than 400 school children came and about 200 adults. And they came to hear a story that, frankly, they knew little about. The daily lives of enslaved people in an urban setting who built, maintained the household, the buildings, did the gardening, raised the animals, kept the horses ready on this property. In the lower picture there, Joseph McGill is talking about these stories as children and other visitors come into the slave quarters, seeing still newspapers plastered on the wall from the 1800s, seeing the old cooking fireplace that was used when it was too cold outside to have or too hot outside, too cold outside, it can be both, to be cooking outside. They learned about how the enslaved people would make bricks. This was a job for everyone. The children carried the bricks back and forth. You can still see fingerprints in the bricks that were handmade from the ground where the house was built. These are made from the clay of Mississippi. And they were experts at making bricks and experts in so much of the work that they did. Michael Twitty came from Washington, D.C. area to teach people about cooking and how the cooking was done. He works hard to illustrate with his own cooking how Southern cuisine is really based on African cuisine. It's really based on what the enslaved people brought from Africa and took what was available in their new world and created a cuisine for the region. Tammy Gibson dresses up as the laundress. I would not want to be the laundress in this particular era. It is a daily job with about 7 different steps, a lot of different chemistry mixed in. It's quite a bit of work. One person cannot do it, and it involves several people. And you can see the school children there, very attentive, asking good questions. It was really quite exciting. We added a museum room into the house after we got it restored a bit, and this room tells the history of a slave that this family once owned in Georgia that actually had made an escape and wrote a book about it. And we were telling that story. This is also the room that I was based in, talking to children about the kind of work that kids did during slavery, one of which was to empty the chamber pots, the bedpans, every day, taking them from the bedrooms upstairs down a very narrow, steep set of stairs just for the enslaved people so they wouldn't be seen by the household, and then depositing the contents of the chamber pots into the hole in the ground. Kids decided the chores they had to do at home were not nearly so bad. But let me tell you just a little bit more about a couple of these people. This is Tammy. Tammy is a wonderful woman from Chicago. She was a laundress. She is very passionate about Black history. Her motto is, Black history is more than 28 days. And she is a storyteller and a educator. And she wants to educate more people about Black history. She's in Africa in this picture, and so she talks about Africa. She calls her, this is really volunteer work she does, she calls her volunteer work Sankofa Traveler. And the Sankofa is a word that is used in one of the languages that's in Ghana that means basically, it's not taboo to go back and fetch what you forgot. That's the literal translation. It really means you need to go back and know about your past before you can know who you are in the present, and certainly before you can create the future you want. So understand who you are in the present, you need to know the past. And so she, in her spare time, which I don't know how she has, but she goes around in her self-contained van. She visits monuments and cemeteries that honor African Americans in our history, and then she puts them on social media to tell us about them and to share what she has learned. And she's here visiting the burial site of a woman who was the first Black person to graduate from New Mexico State University. She graduated in 1937, but she had to take classes often from standing outside the room of the classroom because it was segregated and they wouldn't let her into the classroom, so she would stand and take her notes outside the door. She told us about famous people that we know of. Booker T. Washington, and you can see her there by his grave in Alabama. Victor Hugo Green, who is the publisher and author of the Green Book that was put together so that Black people during the time of Jim Crow knew where it was safe to stay in the South when they visited the South. And then Lucy Diggs Sloat, who, believe it or not, was a tennis player. And in 1917, she was the first African-American woman to win a major sports title. She won the American Tennis Association national title in 1917. She went on to be a professor and administrator at Howard University. So I love to follow her on Facebook because I learn all these new things. Joseph McGill is part of the Gullah Geechee people of South Carolina and Georgia and the island folks who were captured in West Africa and brought to that part of the country. He, for his for his job, is a guide and a historical interpreter at the Magnolia Plantation outside of Charleston. But about a decade ago, he decided to form a enterprise, a volunteer enterprise, called the Slave Dwelling Project. And he's thought, I need to make sure we save these slave dwellings, that this is a part of our history that we need people to know about, we need to save. And the way to do it is I'm going to go sleep in all these slave dwellings that are still here. So he now has been to sleep and to talk about and to publicize more than 50 different slave dwellings around the country. And I'm supposed to find him someplace to spend the night here in Oregon so he can get Oregon on his list too. But he's changing the narrative, one slave dwelling at a time. And usually what he does, he finds someplace he can go. He gathers people around. They have a discussion around a campfire at night, and then people who want to join him can join him in the slave quarter to think about, to honor, to remember the people who were there. So I've thought a lot about both Tammy and Joseph, and thinking about what is it that they are doing this for. Certainly for their own learning, certainly to educate others, but it seemed that there was something deeper to it. And this is what got me started thinking about the concept of spiritual practice. How many of you use that language of spiritual practice? Some of you, a lot of you. What spiritual practices are common to us? Meditation. Singing. Skiing. There's one. Coming to a service. For us Northwesterners, taking a hike in the woods. Meditation, yeah. So there's a lot of spiritual practices that we can get involved in. In seminary, I had a class entirely on spiritual practices, historic and modern, and I remember then I wrote a paper on travel as a spiritual practice, which I think is still something that can be done. So we think of a spiritual practice as an activity that is both intentional, that is process-oriented. It's not one that we necessarily are there for a product, a result, and we do practice it over time. And why do we do these? We do these, people have different answers to this question, of course, to discover and reinforce our deepest values, to clarify our values, to address our longing to connect, to feel closer to the divine, the sacred, the universe, something beyond ourselves, to propel us to a journey of wholeness, to our own true selves. And Felix Adler, who should have been a Unitarian, I tell you, but he says, the spiritual practice help us to become more conscious of our infinite interrelatedness. Doesn't that sound Unitarian Universalist? Yeah. He said that in 1930, I think. So, we'll come back to that in a minute. So why Holly Springs? Well, I've had an interest in social justice for a long time, and that's a whole other story. But what I had for years since I was a kid, really kept up with the civil rights movement back when it was very active. Was an 8th grader when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, watched Huntley Brinkley News and saw all of what was happening. But it took me until I was in college that I really felt like I could do something. I was a little too young to do what other people were doing. And even though I remained glued to the movement, but in college I developed my plan. I would take a bus to Rust College, which was a Methodist-related college, which I grew up in a Methodist-related church and went to a Methodist-related school and figured my parents would let me take this bus to this school in Mississippi. Well, it took a year of convincing, but I did. And this college was founded just after the Civil War, 1866. And it was established by missionaries who had come down with the Freedmen's Aid Society from the north and opened a school. Initially in a church, in a Methodist church, and it accepted adults and kids. And in 78, I believe, during the time of Reconstruction, the first students actually graduated from college. So educating the newly emancipated African Americans. This is what the college looked like, looked more like this when I attended in 74. I got to know the town. It's a lovely little town of 7,000. It's got a beautiful square. It's filled with antebellum houses of different architectures, some of them in good shape, others falling apart. It's a very poor town. Beautiful countryside in the county. You don't necessarily think of Mississippi as beautiful, but there are a number of different parts of Mississippi that are just gorgeous. It also has a difficult history. From its beginning, it became part of the Cotton Empire, And when the railroad was built, it became the commercial and transportation center. It's always had more Africans and then African Americans, more black people in this town than white people from the beginning, because this economy was based on chattel slavery. The square was always busy, a lot going on. And after the war, there was that time of Reconstruction where black people had a little bit of hope that things might be different, might come to some kind of equity, as we learned in the children's story today. Thank you, Conrad. But the powers that be created another game here called sharecropping, which was another form of slavery for so many people in the South. And so equality, not to mention equity, wasn't reached. Oops. There was also, by the end of the 19th century, in the 1890s, Mississippi passed laws that led to continued segregation, voter suppression, and domestic terrorism. This tree is a lynching tree. Keep going backwards on this, sorry. So what are we learning? What are Ron and I learning as we engage in this spiritual practice of working for justice? What is unique about a spiritual practice that is working for justice, at least in our experience that we've had thus far? One is that this isn't an individual thing. Lots of spiritual practices we can do individually, right? We can take ourselves on a hike on the woods. We can meditate. This is not one of those. This is a spiritual practice that has to be we. And you notice I came up with 6 words as I was just brainstorming them, and I don't know why they all start with C's or I's. But cooperation, collaboration, community, interrelatedness, interdependence, inclusion. So we have to do this spiritual practice as a community, as a group. And we have to, it increases our awareness of the interrelatedness of all people and the interdependence of life. So we worked on setting up a new nonprofit that would carry this work forward. I'm skipping a lot of information about how we acquired the house and why. That's another conversation. We'll bring wine for that one. But we're constantly making these community connections and collaboration. We're showing up for things. We're going to concerts. We're going to church. We're getting involved in deep conversations. We're bringing in the NAACP and talking to them. And it's so community is vital. Another learning is that we have to go in with complete humility. We have to know that we're going to make mistakes. We have to know that we have to admit to those mistakes. We have to learn. We have to have an open mind. And we have to be patient. We want the world to change, but it ain't going to change quickly. So we come in humble that we don't have the answers. We're there to help facilitate the conversation, help facilitate the project. And these people help us stay humble. Another part of this kind of spiritual practice, it's always a practice that we do the practice, we reflect on it, we learn from that, we try something again, we reflect on it, we learn from it. We're always having to reflect on it. We can't just do, we have to think. What are we doing? What are the outcomes? What works and what doesn't work? My grandma, when she was 80, she wrote a little statement about her values, kind of a this I believe, that you're going to talk about next Sunday. This I believe. And she described heaven. She says, I don't know what heaven's going to be like, but it must have continued learning. I thought, oh my goodness, even when we go to heaven, we have to keep learning. I guess so. But so we're doing that in this spiritual practice. We keep learning. Working for justice is a long process. We have to figure out how to maintain our humanity. We have to be able to choose and practice joy. We have to bring hope, choose joy in a broken world. And as I've watched people in this community who have had 180 years of oppression, and still they celebrate, still they see their humanity and relatedness and are able to bring joy to their daily life in a way that is hard for me to understand. But it gives me inspiration that who am I to say, I can't do this work, it's too hard, you know? So choose and practice joy, bring hope. The people have been such an inspiration. You gotta get a little music in there too. It's a great blues country there. And we go out and walk in the forest as well. Oops. So let's see, I'm just going to stop right there. And that's where I'll end. Oh, almost on time. So I'll end right there, and I'm going to invite Brian back up. I think you are going to lead us in a little meditation now. Is that right? Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have arrived at 11 o'clock, but Dr. Godard will be here after service for us to talk to, and we can find out more about what this project has done for her and for her husband. Thank you so much. What an amazing and beautiful presentation and inspiration to us all. So we'll have just a moment of meditation.